The sound of Derek's pen scratching against paper filled the silent courtroom like nails on a chalkboard. I watched from across the mahogany table as my husband of 8 years signed our divorce papers with the same casual indifference he'd shown when signing grocery lists. His lips curved into that smug smile I'd grown to despise, the one that said he believed he'd won everything and left me with nothing. "Well, that was easier than I thought," Derek muttered to his high-priced attorney, loud enough for me and my court-appointed lawyer to hear. His voice carried that familiar tone of superiority that had slowly chipped away at my self-worth over the years. "I almost feel bad for her." Almost. The word stung more than if he'd just said he felt nothing at all. Judge Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked over her glasses at Derek with obvious disapproval. "Mr. Thompson, please show respect for these proceedings and your wife." "Soon-to-be ex-wife," Derek corrected with a chuckle, straightening his expensive navy suit. The same suit I'd helped him pick out for his promotion last year, back when I still believed we were building a life together. "And with all due respect, Your Honor, I think we can all agree this is long overdue. Amara will be much better off without me holding her back." The cruel irony in his voice made my stomach turn. He was the one who had insisted I quit my marketing job to support his career. He was the one who had convinced me we didn't need separate bank accounts because married couples should share everything. He was the one who had systematically removed my independence while building his own empire, and now he sat there pretending he was doing me a favor. I kept my hands folded in my lap, digging my nails into my palms to keep from trembling. My simple black dress felt shabby compared to Derek's polished appearance, and I knew that was exactly the image he wanted to project. Successful businessman divorcing his struggling wife who couldn't keep up with his ambitions. Derek's attorney, a sharp-faced man named Preston who charged more per hour than most people made in a week, leaned over to whisper something in Derek's ear. They both glanced at me and smiled. I didn't need to hear their words to know they were celebrating their victory. From the corner of my eye, I caught sight of her. Candace sat in the back row of the courtroom, trying to look inconspicuous in her red dress and designer heels. My replacement. Derek's secretary turned mistress, though she preferred to call herself his business partner now. She was everything I wasn't. Blonde, ambitious, and willing to use whatever means necessary to get what she wanted. Including sleeping with her married boss. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek was divorcing me to marry another woman, yet somehow I was the one who looked desperate and alone in this courtroom. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Harrison addressed me directly and I straightened in my chair. "Do you have anything you'd like to say before we finalize these proceedings?" I opened my mouth then closed it again. What could I say? That my husband had cheated on me? That he'd manipulated our finances so everything was in his name? That he'd made me financially dependent on him and then discarded me like yesterday's newspaper? The facts were all there in the legal documents, but facts didn't capture the emotional devastation of 8 years of marriage ending with such calculated cruelty. "No, Your Honor," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Derek's smirk widened. "See? Even she knows this is for the best." My lawyer, Mrs. Patterson, a kind older woman who was working my case pro bono, shuffled through her papers nervously. She'd warned me this wouldn't go well. Derek had the better legal team, more resources, and had positioned himself advantageously in every aspect of our divorce. According to the settlement, I would get the house, which was mortgaged to the hilt, our old Honda, which needed constant repairs, and a small monthly alimony payment that would barely cover basic expenses. Derek, meanwhile, would keep his successful consulting business, his BMW, his boat, and his substantial retirement accounts. He'd also managed to hide several assets offshore, though we couldn't prove it in court. "Before we conclude," Mrs. Patterson said suddenly, standing up and clearing her throat, "there is one matter we need to address regarding Mrs. Thompson's inheritance from her late father." Derek's smile faltered slightly. "What inheritance? Her dad was a janitor who died 5 years ago." The dismissive way he said janitor made my blood boil. My father Robert had worked multiple jobs to provide for our family after my mother passed away. He'd been a night janitor, yes, but he'd also done maintenance work, handyman services, and had always been involved in various small business ventures. Derek had never respected my father, always treating him like he was beneath us socially. "That's what we're here to clarify," Mrs. Patterson replied calmly, though I could see her hands shaking slightly as she reached into her briefcase. "It appears there are some legal documents that were never properly processed after Mr. Robert Mitchell's passing." Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest. "What kind of documents?" "His last will and testament, Your Honor. Due to some administrative oversights at the probate court, It was never officially read or executed. Derek laughed outright. This is ridiculous. We're wasting the court's time over some old man's will? What could he possibly have left her? His collection of work boots. Candace giggled from the back row, and Derek turned to wink at her. Their public display of affection in our divorce proceedings felt like salt in an open wound. But something in Mrs. Patterson's expression gave me hope for the first time in months. She wasn't the type to bring up pointless legal documents just to stall proceedings. There was something in her eyes that suggested she knew something Derek didn't. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson continued, I request that we postpone the finalization of this divorce until Mr. Mitchell's will can be properly read and executed, as it may significantly impact the division of assets. Derek's attorney jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. This is clearly a stall tactic. Mr. Mitchell passed away 5 years ago. Any inheritance would have been processed long ago. Not necessarily, Judge Harrison replied thoughtfully. If there were administrative errors in the probate process, the will could still be legally valid and unexecuted. Mrs. Patterson, do you have documentation to support this claim? Mrs. Patterson handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. As Judge Harrison began reviewing the documents, the courtroom fell silent except for the sound of pages turning and Derek's increasingly agitated breathing. I watched my husband's confident facade begin to crack as the minutes ticked by. He kept glancing back at Candace, then at his attorney, then at the judge. For the first time since this whole process began, Derek looked uncertain. This is highly irregular, Preston muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Judge Harrison finally looked up from the documents, her expression unreadable. I'm going to need time to review these materials properly. This court will recess for 1 week to allow for proper examination of Mr. Robert Mitchell's estate and will. Derek shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is absurd. We can't postpone our entire divorce because of some paperwork mix-up from 5 years ago. Mr. Thompson, I suggest you lower your voice in my courtroom, Judge Harrison replied sternly. And I suggest you take this week to consider that there might be more to your wife's family than you assumed. As the judge's gavel came down, declaring court adjourned, I saw something I'd never seen before in Derek's eyes: fear. For 8 years he'd controlled every aspect of our relationship, always staying one step ahead, always holding all the cards. But now, for the first time, he didn't know what was coming next. Neither did I, but for the first time in months, I felt a spark of something I'd almost forgotten: hope. 6 months earlier, I had been living in a completely different world. A world where I trusted my husband completely, where I believed our marriage was solid despite its rough patches, and where the biggest worry in my life was whether Derek would remember to pick up groceries on his way home from work. It was a Tuesday evening in March when everything changed. I remember the exact date because it was the day after our 8th wedding anniversary, which Derek had forgotten entirely until I mentioned it at breakfast. He'd promised to make it up to me with a special dinner that weekend, but as usual, work had gotten in the way. Derek's consulting firm had been growing rapidly over the past few years. What had started as a small business advisory service had expanded into a major operation with corporate clients and government contracts. I was proud of his success, even though it meant longer hours, more travel, and less time together. I told myself it was temporary, that once he got the business fully established, we'd have the time and financial security to start the family we'd been talking about for years. I'd been home all day working on freelance graphic design projects, trying to build up some income after Derek had suggested I quit my full-time marketing position 3 years earlier. We don't need the stress of 2 demanding careers, he'd said. This way you can focus on the creative work you love and I can build something big enough for both of us. At the time it had seemed romantic. My husband wanted to take care of me, to give me the freedom to pursue my passion projects. I didn't realize then that financial independence and creative freedom were 2 very different things, and that losing the first would gradually erode the second. That Tuesday evening, Derek had called around 5 to say he'd be working late again. His secretary Candace was helping him prepare for a big presentation, he explained, and they needed to get everything perfect before the client meeting the next morning. It wasn't unusual. Candace had been working closely with Derek for about a year, and I'd always been grateful that he had such a dedicated assistant to help manage his increasingly hectic schedule. I'd met Candace several times at company events and she seemed nice enough, though there was something about her bright smile and overly familiar way of talking about Derek that had always made me slightly uncomfortable. She was the type of woman who remembered everyone's personal details and made a point of asking about your life in a way that felt both caring and intrusive at the same time. Derek talks about you constantly, she told me at the Christmas party just a few months earlier. He's so lucky to have someone who understands his ambition. Not every woman would be supportive of a husband who works as hard as he does. At the time, I'd taken it as a compliment. Looking back, I realized it was probably a test to see how much I knew about exactly how many hours Derek was really working. That Tuesday evening, I decided to surprise him. I'd spent the afternoon making his favorite lasagna, and I thought I'd drive to his office with dinner for both of them. It seemed like a nice gesture, something a supportive wife would do. Maybe Candace would appreciate the meal too, since she was staying late to help. Derek's office was in a converted warehouse downtown that he'd renovated into a modern workspace. The building was usually locked after hours, but Derek had given me the security code months ago. The parking lot was nearly empty except for Derek's BMW and a red Mercedes that I recognized as Candace's car. I used my key to enter through the main lobby, balancing the warm casserole dish and a bag of salad and breadsticks. The elevator to Derek's floor seemed to take forever, and I found myself getting excited about surprising him. We'd been distant lately, both caught up in our own daily routines, and I hoped this spontaneous gesture might help us reconnect. The elevator opened onto Derek's floor, and I immediately noticed that most of the office lights were off. Only the glow from Derek's corner office illuminated the otherwise dark workspace. I could hear voices coming from that direction, and I smiled, imagining Derek and Candace hunched over spreadsheets and presentation slides. I was halfway across the main office area when I heard Derek laugh. Not his polite, professional laugh, but the deep, genuine laugh he used to reserve just for me. The sound made me pause, and that's when I heard Candace's voice, low and intimate in a way that made my stomach clench with sudden dread. "You're terrible," she was saying, but her tone was playful, flirtatious. "What if someone comes in?" "Nobody's coming in," Derek replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Besides, I pay the rent on this place. I should be able to do whatever I want here." My hands started trembling, nearly dropping the casserole dish. I knew I should announce myself, call out that I was there, but something kept me frozen in place behind a partition wall, listening to my marriage fall apart one word at a time. "I love when you get all possessive and powerful," Candace purred. "It's so different from how you are at home." The casual way she referenced my home, my marriage, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a new development. This was an established relationship with its own inside jokes and familiar rhythms. "Don't talk about home," Derek said, and for a moment I hoped he was drawing boundaries, protecting our marriage. "You know that situation is complicated." "Situation?" Candace laughed. "Is that what we're calling your wife now? Amara is, she's a good person. But she doesn't understand what it takes to build something real. She's content with small dreams, small goals. She doesn't push me to be better like you do." I pressed my back against the partition wall, feeling like I might be sick. This was how Derek really saw me? As someone holding him back from his potential? "When are you going to tell her?" Candace asked. "Soon. I need to get the business restructured first, make sure all the assets are properly positioned. I can't afford to lose half of everything I've built because I was careless about timing." "You mean half of everything we've built," Candace corrected. "I've been working just as hard as you have to grow this company." "Of course, baby. We built this together. That's why I need to be smart about how I handle the divorce. Amara thinks she's entitled to half of everything just because we're married, but she has no idea how much this business is really worth now." Divorce. The word hit me like a sledgehammer. He was already planning to divorce me, already calculating how to minimize what I'd get from the settlement. I'd been worried about us growing apart, but he'd been actively plotting to leave me while I made him lasagna and worried about whether he was eating enough vegetables. "She's going to be so shocked," Candace said with obvious satisfaction. "She really has no clue, does she?" "None at all. She still thinks I'm the same guy she married 8 years ago, struggling to get his business off the ground. She has no idea about the government contracts, the offshore accounts, any of it. As far as she knows, we're barely breaking even." They were both laughing now, and the sound was like glass breaking in my chest. I thought about all the times Derek had told me we needed to be careful with money, that the business was still touch and go, that we couldn't afford for me to be spending too much on groceries or clothes. Meanwhile, he'd apparently been hiding a fortune and planning to keep it all for himself. "I should feel guilty," Derek continued, "but honestly she's been so checked out lately. All she does is sit at home working on those little design projects that barely pay anything. She has no ambition, no drive. Sometimes I think she'd be happier without the pressure of being married to someone who's actually trying to succeed in life." That was the final straw. Derek wasn't just cheating on me and planning to divorce me, he was rewriting our entire marriage history to make himself the victim. I was the one who had sacrificed my career to support his dreams. I was the one who had managed our household, entertained his clients, and worked freelance jobs that barely paid the bills because he'd convinced me his business needed all our resources to grow. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the casserole dish. I made it to the elevator without them hearing me, but once the doors closed, I completely fell apart. 8 years of marriage, and this was how little I'd meant to him. I wasn't even worth an honest conversation about his unhappiness. I was just an obstacle to be managed and eventually discarded. The drive home was a blur of tears and disbelief. I kept thinking there had to be some explanation, some context I was missing. Maybe they were talking about a business partnership, or maybe Derek was just venting his frustrations without really meaning any of it. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard. I knew the tone in their voices, the casual intimacy that spoke of a relationship that had been going on for months, maybe longer. When I got home, I threw the lasagna in the trash and sat at our kitchen table, staring at the wedding photos on the wall. In every picture, Derek and I looked happy, in love, committed to building a life together. I tried to pinpoint when that had changed, when I'd become a situation, instead of his partner. Derek came home around midnight, whistling cheerfully as he walked through the door. He found me still sitting at the kitchen table, though I'd cleaned up my tears and tried to compose myself. "Hey babe," he said, kissing the top of my head like nothing had changed. "Sorry I'm so late. That presentation kicked my ass, but I think we nailed it." I wanted to confront him right then, to demand answers and honesty. But something held me back. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was some survival instinct telling me I needed to be smarter about this. If Derek was planning to divorce me and hide his assets, I needed to be prepared. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I showed my hand. "That's great, honey," I managed to say. "I'm proud of you." He smiled and headed upstairs to shower, completely oblivious to the fact that our marriage had just ended in his office downtown. As I listened to the water running, I realized that the man I'd loved and trusted for 8 years was essentially a stranger. And if he could lie to me so easily about something this fundamental, what else had he been lying about? That night was the beginning of the longest 6 months of my life, pretending everything was normal while secretly trying to figure out how to survive what was coming. But it was also the beginning of me remembering who I'd been before Derek had convinced me to make myself smaller to fit into his vision of the perfect supportive wife. I just had no idea yet how much my father's memory was about to change everything. 2 weeks after discovering Derek's affair, I finally worked up the courage to see a lawyer. I'd spent those 2 weeks in a fog of denial and desperation, secretly hoping I'd misunderstood what I'd overheard, that there was some innocent explanation for Derek's words about divorce and hidden assets. But every day brought new evidence of his deception. Derek had become even more secretive about his phone, taking calls in private and working late almost every night. He'd also started making comments about my freelance work, subtle criticisms about how I was wasting my potential on small projects instead of thinking bigger. I realized now that he was laying the groundwork for his narrative about why our marriage had failed, painting me as unambitious and unmotivated. Finding a lawyer had been harder than I'd expected. Derek knew every attorney in town through his business connections, and I was terrified that word would get back to him before I was ready. I'd finally found Mrs. Patterson through a women's support group I'd discovered online. She specialized in helping women navigate difficult divorces, particularly cases where there were hidden assets or financial manipulation involved. Her office was in an older building downtown, nothing like the sleek glass tower where Derek's attorney worked. Mrs. Patterson herself was in her early 60s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She offered me tea and spoke in a gentle voice that made me feel like maybe I wasn't going crazy after all. "Tell me about your situation, Amara," she said, settling back in her chair with a legal pad ready. I started with the affair, explaining what I'd overheard at Derek's office. Mrs. Patterson nodded sympathetically but didn't seem particularly surprised. She'd probably heard similar stories dozens of times before. "And he mentioned restructuring assets and positioning them for a divorce?" she asked. "Yes. He said something about not wanting me to get half of what he'd built, and he mentioned offshore accounts. I had no idea we had offshore accounts." Mrs. Patterson made notes as I talked. "How long have you been married?" 8 years. "We started dating 10 years ago, right after I graduated college." "And what was your financial situation when you married?" I thought back to those early days when Derek was just starting his consulting business and I was working at a marketing firm downtown. We'd both been young and hopeful, living in a tiny apartment and dreaming about our future together. We were both pretty much starting from nothing. Derek had just launched his business, and I was working an entry-level job. We pooled our resources to get by, but there wasn't much to pool. When did you quit your job? 3 years ago. Derek said it would be better for his business if I could be more flexible, help with entertaining clients and managing our home life. He convinced me that my salary wasn't worth the stress it was causing both of us. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her notes. And since then you've been financially dependent on Derek? I do freelance graphic design work, but it doesn't pay much. Derek handles all our major finances. I have access to our joint checking account for household expenses, but he manages everything else. Do you know the extent of his business assets? That's just it, I said, feeling foolish. I thought I did, but apparently not. Derek always told me the business was just getting by, that we needed to be careful with spending. But from what I overheard, it sounds like he's been making a lot more money than I knew about. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. Amara, I need to be honest with you about what you're facing here. If Derek has been planning this divorce for months and positioning assets accordingly, he's got a significant advantage. Hiding marital assets is illegal, but it's also very difficult to prove, especially if he's had time to move money around. My heart sank. So there's nothing I can do? I didn't say that. But you need to understand that this is going to be an uphill battle. Derek has resources, he has time to prepare, and he clearly has experience with complex financial transactions. You're starting from behind. She pulled out a thick folder and began showing me documents I'd need to gather. Tax returns, bank statements, business records, anything that could help establish the true extent of Derek's assets. The problem is, most of this information is probably in Derek's control. Joint tax returns will show some of his income, but if he's been hiding assets offshore or in business partnerships, that won't show up on documents you have access to. What about his business? I know some of his clients and I've attended company events. Doesn't that give me some claim to what he's built? Mrs. Patterson's expression was gentle but realistic. In theory, yes. As his spouse, you're entitled to half of any marital assets, including business growth during your marriage. But Derek's business is structured as a separate entity, and if he's been careful about how he's documented your contributions, it's going to be very difficult to establish your claim to those assets. I felt tears starting to form. So he can just cheat on me, lie to me for months, hide money from me, and then divorce me with nothing? Not nothing, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. You're entitled to spousal support, and you have rights that Derek can't just ignore. But I want you to have realistic expectations about what we're dealing with here. She showed me a chart outlining typical divorce settlements in cases like mine. Even in the best-case scenario, I was looking at a modest monthly alimony payment, maybe half the equity in our house, which wasn't much since Derek had refinanced it several times to fund his business, and possibly a small settlement if we could prove hidden assets. What about the house? I asked. You'll probably get to keep it, but Derek will want half the equity and you'll be responsible for the mortgage payments. Can you afford that on your potential income? I did the math in my head and realized I couldn't. The house payment alone was more than I could make with freelance work, and that wasn't even counting utilities, taxes, and maintenance. So I'll have to sell it? Most likely yes. And after paying Derek his share and covering selling costs, you'll probably have enough for a deposit on a small apartment and maybe a few months of expenses. The reality was starting to sink in. Derek wasn't just leaving me. He was ensuring that I'd have to start over from nothing while he moved on to his new life with Candace and all the wealth they'd built together. There is one thing that might help, Mrs. Patterson said, flipping through her notes. You mentioned your father passed away 5 years ago. Did he leave any assets, any inheritance? Not really. Dad worked hard his whole life, but he wasn't wealthy. He left me a few $1,000s and some personal items, but I used most of the money for his funeral expenses. What about property? Business interests? Even small investments can add up over time. I shook my head. Dad was a janitor and he did some handyman work on the side. He rented a small apartment his whole life. He never owned property or had any business investments that I knew of. Mrs. Patterson made a note. Sometimes people have assets that their families don't know about. Small business partnerships, investments, even life insurance policies that weren't processed properly. Do you have any of your father's papers? Some. They're in storage in our basement. I never went through everything because it was too painful right after he died. I'd recommend taking a look through those documents. Sometimes there are surprises, and even a small inheritance could give you more leverage in the divorce proceedings. As our meeting wrapped up, Mrs. Patterson explained her fee structure. She was willing to work with me on a payment plan, understanding that my resources were limited. She also gave me a list of steps to take immediately, start documenting everything, gather whatever financial records I could access, and begin establishing my own credit and bank accounts. Most importantly, she said as I prepared to leave, don't let on to Derek that you know about the affair or that you're planning to file for divorce. The element of surprise is one of the few advantages you have right now. Driving home, I felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what I was facing. Derek had spent months preparing for this divorce while I'd been completely oblivious. He had money, lawyers, and a clear plan. I had a pro bono attorney and the advice to look through my dead father's old papers. But as I pulled into our driveway and saw Derek's BMW already in the garage, I made myself a promise. I might be starting from behind, but I wasn't going to make it easy for him. If Derek wanted to destroy our marriage and leave me with nothing, he was going to have to work for it. That evening, after Derek had gone to bed claiming exhaustion from another long day at the office, I crept down to our basement storage room. Among the Christmas decorations and old furniture, I found the boxes of my father's belongings I'd packed away 5 years ago. As I opened the first box and saw my father's handwriting on old receipts and business cards, I felt a wave of grief and regret. Dad had always been so proud of me, so supportive of my dreams. What would he think of the situation I'd gotten myself into? What would he say about Derek's betrayal and my naive trust? But as I began sorting through the papers, I started to notice things that didn't quite fit my memory of my father's simple life. Business cards for companies I'd never heard of, receipts for expensive equipment, and correspondence with lawyers and accountants. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe there were surprises waiting to be discovered. I had no idea just how right she was. As I sat surrounded by dusty boxes in our basement, sorting through my father's belongings, memories of Robert Mitchell came flooding back. The fluorescent light cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor, but in my mind, I was transported back to my childhood, trying to reconcile the man I remembered with the mysterious documents I was discovering. My father had been the most dependable person in my life. After my mother died when I was 12, he'd stepped into both parental roles without missing a beat. While other single fathers might have struggled with the transition, Dad had seamlessly managed everything from helping with homework to braiding my hair for school dances. Your mama always said you were special, Amara? He used to tell me during those difficult months after her passing. She made me promise to make sure you knew how smart and capable you are. You're going to do things in life that'll make us both proud. Dad worked nights as a janitor at the big office complex downtown, the same building where Derek's company was now located. The irony of that wasn't lost on me as I rifled through receipts and business cards. Dad would leave for work just as I was finishing dinner, and he'd be home in time to make me breakfast before school. I never felt like I was missing out on having a father around because he made every moment we spent together count. But there had always been other things going on in Dad's life that I didn't fully understand as a child. He'd have meetings on weekends with men in nice suits who would come to our small apartment. They'd sit at our kitchen table drinking coffee while I watched cartoons in the living room, speaking in low voices about investments and opportunities and partnerships. When I'd ask Dad about these meetings, he'd just smile and ruffle my hair. Business stuff, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. Your job is to focus on school and being a kid. I'd accepted that explanation without question. Dad was always involved in some side hustle or another. He'd fix cars for neighbors in our apartment complex's parking lot, do handyman work for local businesses, and occasionally disappear for entire weekends on what he called consulting jobs. I assumed it was all just his way of making extra money to support us. Now, looking through his papers, I was seeing evidence of a much more complex business life than I'd ever imagined. There were contracts for construction projects, invoices for equipment rentals, and correspondence with people who clearly regarded my father as much more than a part-time handyman. One business card particularly caught my attention. It was for someone named Thomas Crawford, and it was embossed with gold lettering that read Crawford Development Group, Commercial Real Estate. On the back, in my father's handwriting, were numbers that looked like dollar amounts, followed by percentages and dates. I found similar cards for a dozen other businesses, construction companies, property management firms, and investment groups. Each card had notes in my father's neat handwriting, tracking what appeared to be financial relationships or business deals. There was also a leather-bound appointment book that covered the last 2 years of Dad's life. As I flipped through it, I saw meetings scheduled almost every week with various business contacts. These weren't casual coffee meetings. They were formal appointments at offices downtown, scheduled around Dad's janitor shifts and carefully planned to fit into his complicated schedule. One entry stood out to me: meeting with Harrison and Associates 2 p.m. Tuesday re. Amara's future. The date was just 6 months before Dad died, and the Amara's future, note sent chills down my spine. What had Dad been planning for my future? And who were Harrison and Associates? I found the answer in another box, tucked inside an old manila envelope. It was a business card for Harrison and Associates, attorneys at law, along with a handwritten note from someone named Judge Harrison. Robert, thank you for your trust in our firm. We'll make sure everything is handled exactly as you specified. Amara will be well taken care of when the time comes. Judge Harrison. The same judge who was overseeing my divorce case. The coincidence seemed impossible, but there was the business card with the familiar name and address. As I continued searching, I found bank statements that made no sense. Dad had always been careful with money, but these statements showed regular deposits of thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands going back years. The deposits came from various sources: Crawford Development Group, Mitchell and Associates Construction, Riverside Property Management, and several others. Mitchell and Associates Construction. Dad's name was part of the company name. That suggested he wasn't just an employee or contractor. He was a partner or owner in multiple businesses. I found incorporation papers that confirmed my suspicions. Robert Mitchell was listed as a founding partner in Mitchell and Associates Construction, a 25% owner of Crawford Development Group, and had significant stakes in 4 other companies. According to the documents, these weren't small operations. Crawford Development Group alone had assets worth millions of dollars. My hands were shaking as I realized what this meant. My father hadn't been just a janitor who did handyman work on the side. He'd been a successful businessman who had built a substantial empire while maintaining his night job, probably for the health insurance and steady income while his investments grew. But why had he hidden this from me? Why had he continued to live in our small apartment and maintain such a modest lifestyle when he apparently had access to considerable wealth? I found the answer in a letter addressed to me, sealed in an envelope with my name written in Dad's careful handwriting. The envelope was thick and heavy, clearly containing multiple pages. My heart pounded as I opened it, feeling like I was about to have a conversation with my father 5 years after his death. My dearest Amara, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've finally decided to go through these old boxes. I always wondered when curiosity would get the better of you. Even in death, Dad knew me so well. I could hear his gentle teasing in those words. I know this is going to come as a shock, sweetheart, but your old dad wasn't quite as simple as he seemed. Those weekend meetings and business trips weren't just small-time hustles. Over the years, I built something real, something substantial. But I want you to understand why I kept it from you. The letter went on to explain Dad's philosophy about money and success. He'd grown up poor and had seen how wealth could change people, make them forget their values and lose sight of what was truly important. He'd also seen how knowledge of family money could make young people complacent, less motivated to develop their own skills and character. I wanted you to become the person you were meant to be based on your own talents and drive, not because you knew there was money waiting for you. I wanted you to choose your husband for love, not financial security. I wanted you to pursue your dreams because they mattered to you, not because you had the luxury of a safety net. Dad had been watching my life carefully, making sure I was developing into the kind of person who could handle wealth responsibly. He'd been proud when I'd graduated college and started my career in marketing. He'd been less thrilled when I'd quit my job to support Derek's business, but he'd kept his opinions to himself. By now, you're probably wondering why I stayed in that little apartment and kept working as a janitor when I had all these business interests. The truth is, I loved that job. It kept me grounded, reminded me every day what real work looked like. And it was the perfect cover for my business activities. Nobody expects a night janitor to be closing million-dollar real estate deals. The letter revealed that Dad had been incredibly strategic about building his wealth while maintaining his privacy. He'd used the night shift to his advantage, conducting business meetings during the day when most people were at work, and using his janitorial job as a way to gather intelligence about the companies and business leaders he was dealing with. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about a company by emptying their trash and cleaning their offices, Dad wrote with obvious amusement. People think janitors are invisible, so they talk freely around us. I probably knew more about the local business community than most CEOs. But the most important part of the letter came near the end. I've set everything up so that you'll inherit my business interests, but only when you really need them. I've instructed my lawyers to wait until you're facing a significant life challenge before revealing the extent of your inheritance. I wanted to make sure you'd had the chance to prove yourself as an independent woman first. Dad had somehow anticipated that I might one day need his help, even though he'd died years before Derek's betrayal. He'd created a safety net that would only activate when I was truly vulnerable, ensuring that I'd never become dependent on his wealth but would have access to it when I needed it most. If you're reading this letter, it probably means you're going through something difficult. Maybe it's a divorce or financial troubles, or some other crisis that's made you desperate enough to dig through your old dad's dusty papers. Whatever it is, sweetheart, I want you to know that you're stronger than you think you are. But you don't have to face it alone. The letter included detailed instructions for contacting Harrison and Associates and accessing what Dad called the full documentation of your inheritance. There were safe deposit box keys, account numbers, and contact information for various business partners who had been instructed to help me understand my father's empire. At the bottom of the letter, Dad had written a final message that brought tears to my eyes. You were always my greatest investment, Amara. Not because of what you might inherit someday but because of who you are. Your mama and I created something beautiful when we made you. Don't let anyone convince you that you're worth less than everything. Sitting in that basement surrounded by the evidence of my father's secret life, I realized that Derek's betrayal hadn't left me powerless after all. Dad had been planning for this possibility for years, building not just wealth but a support system that would activate exactly when I needed it most. For the first time in months, I felt like maybe I wasn't facing this battle alone. My father had been preparing me for this fight without me even knowing it. Tomorrow, I would call Harrison and Associates and begin to understand just how much my father had really left me. But tonight, I just sat in the basement holding his letter, feeling his love and protection reaching across 5 years to remind me who I really was. Derek thought he'd married a naive woman with no resources and no power. He was about to discover just how wrong he'd been about that. The next morning, I waited until Derek left for work before making the call to Harrison and Associates. My hands shook as I dialed the number from my father's letter, still not quite believing that this could be real. Part of me expected to reach a disconnected number or a confused secretary who had never heard of Robert Mitchell. Instead, a professional voice answered immediately. Harrison and Associates, this is Margaret speaking. How may I help you? Hi, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My name is Amara Thompson, formerly Amara Mitchell. I believe you have some documents related to my father, Robert Mitchell? There was a brief pause, then Margaret's voice became notably warmer. Ms. Mitchell, we've been waiting for your call for quite some time. Let me connect you with Mr. Harrison immediately. Within seconds, a deep, familiar voice came on the line. Amara, this is Judge Harrison. I'm so glad you finally reached out. Judge Harrison. The same man who was overseeing my divorce case knew about my father's business affairs. The coincidence was starting to feel less like chance and more like careful planning on Dad's part. I'm confused, I admitted. You're the judge in my divorce case, aren't you? Judge Harrison chuckled. Actually, no. That's my wife, Judge Patricia Harrison. I'm retired from the bench now and work primarily with estate planning and business law. Your father was one of my longest-standing clients. How did he know that I would need help? And how did he know your wife would be handling my case? Your father was an exceptionally perceptive man, Amara. He didn't know the specific details of what you'd face, but he understood that someday you might find yourself in a situation where you needed resources and legal support. As for my wife handling your divorce, that's just fortunate timing. When I heard her mention your name last week, I realized that your father's contingency plans were about to become very relevant. Judge Harrison explained that he'd been managing my father's business interests and estate planning for over 15 years. Dad had been very specific about when and how I should learn about my inheritance. He instructed me to wait until you contacted us directly, which meant you'd discovered his papers and were actively seeking help. He wanted to ensure you were truly in need before revealing the full extent of what he'd built for you. What exactly did he build? I asked, still hardly daring to hope. Why don't you come to my office this afternoon? I think it's better if I show you the documents in person. Bring identification and any papers you found in your father's belongings. We have quite a bit to discuss. After hanging up, I spent the morning in a strange state of suspended reality. I went through the motions of normal life, working on a freelance design project and doing laundry, but my mind was racing with possibilities. Every time Derek had dismissed my father as just a janitor, every time he'd made me feel like I came from nothing and should be grateful for his success, he'd been fundamentally wrong about who I was and where I came from. That afternoon, I drove to Harrison and Associates' office in the financial district downtown. The building was impressive, all glass and marble, nothing like the modest legal office where I'd met Mrs. Patterson. Judge Harrison met me in the lobby personally, a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded me of my father. You look just like your mother, he said as we rode the elevator to his office. Your father talked about both of you constantly. He was so proud of the woman you'd become. Judge Harrison's office was spacious and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But what caught my attention was the wall of photographs showing him with various business leaders and politicians, including several photos with my father at construction sites and business events. Your father and I met 20 years ago when he was looking to invest some money he'd saved, Judge Harrison explained as we settled into leather chairs around a conference table. He was one of the smartest men I ever knew, completely self-taught when it came to business and investing. He opened a thick file folder and spread documents across the table. Let me show you what your father built. The first document was a comprehensive asset summary that made my head spin. Robert Mitchell's estate was worth just over $8 million, spread across real estate holdings, business partnerships, investment accounts, and various other assets. $8 million? I whispered, staring at the number. That's the current valuation, yes. Your father was particularly good at identifying undervalued properties in business opportunities. He had a talent for seeing potential where others saw problems. Judge Harrison showed me property deeds for 12 commercial buildings around the city, including the office complex where Derek's company was located. My father had been Derek's landlord for the past 3 years, something Derek had never mentioned and probably didn't even know. Dad owned Derek's building? Among others. Your father was very strategic about his real estate investments. He preferred commercial properties with stable, long-term tenants. There were also partnership agreements showing Dad's involvement in 6 different businesses, including the construction company that bore his name and a property development firm that had worked on several major projects around the city. But how did he manage all of this while working as a janitor? I asked. Your father was a master of compartmentalization. He kept his business activities completely separate from his personal life. Most of his business partners knew him as Bob Mitchell, successful investor and businessman. They had no idea he also worked nights as a janitor. Judge Harrison explained that Dad had used his janitorial job strategically, not just as steady income but as a way to gather information about the companies and business leaders he was dealing with. He'd learned which companies were struggling financially, which ones were expanding, and which business leaders were trustworthy, all by observing their operations from the inside. Your father was probably the most well-informed businessman in this city, Judge Harrison said with obvious admiration. He knew more about local companies than their own boards of directors did. But the most shocking revelation came when Judge Harrison showed me a surveillance report that Dad had commissioned about Derek 2 years ago. Your father was concerned about your husband's business practices, Judge Harrison said carefully. He suspected there might be some irregularities in how Derek was managing his company finances. The report detailed Derek's business operations, including evidence of the offshore accounts he'd mentioned to Candace and documentation of several questionable financial transactions. Dad had known about Derek's hidden assets long before I'd discovered the affair. Why didn't he tell me? I asked. He wanted you to make your own decisions about your marriage. But he also wanted to make sure you'd have leverage if Derek ever tried to leave you financially vulnerable. Judge Harrison handed me another document that made my breath catch. It was a detailed dossier on Derek's affair with Candace, including photographs, financial records showing Derek spending on her, and evidence of their business relationship that went far beyond what Derek had told me. Your father hired investigators? I felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment that Dad had known about problems in my marriage before I did. He was protecting his investment, Judge Harrison said with a slight smile. Not his financial investment, but his investment in you. He knew that knowledge was power, and he wanted to make sure you'd have all the information you needed when the time came. The file included evidence that Derek and Candace had been planning to start their own company using assets they'd hidden from Derek's current business. They'd been systematically moving money and clients to prepare for their new venture, which explained why Derek had been so confident about the divorce proceedings. This is all legal evidence? I asked. Completely legal and admissible in court. Your father made sure everything was obtained through proper channels. Judge Harrison then showed me the final piece of the puzzle. Dad's will, which had never been properly probated due to what appeared to be administrative errors at the courthouse. Your father was very specific about the timing of when this will should be revealed, Judge Harrison explained. He instructed me to wait until you were facing a significant life crisis and had actively sought help by going through his papers. The administrative delays in probating the will were actually intentional, designed to ensure you'd inherit at exactly the right moment. The will was comprehensive and clearly written. It left me everything. The businesses, the properties, the investment accounts, and liquid assets totaling over $2 million that I could access immediately. There's one more thing, Judge Harrison said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name on it. Your father asked me to give this to you when we met. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000 and a note in Dad's handwriting. For immediate expenses and legal fees. Don't let anyone push you around, sweetheart. You're Robert Mitchell's daughter, and that means something in this city. As I sat in Judge Harrison's office, surrounded by evidence of my father's love and foresight, I realized that everything had changed. Derek thought he was divorcing a powerless woman who would have to accept whatever scraps he offered. Instead, he was about to face someone who had more resources and better legal documentation than he did. What happens next? I asked. Judge Harrison smiled. Next, we make sure your divorce proceedings reflect your actual financial position. And we make sure Derek understands that cheating on Robert Mitchell's daughter was the biggest mistake of his business career. For the first time in months, I felt powerful. Derek had underestimated me just like he'd underestimated my father. He was about to learn that the woman he'd betrayed wasn't as helpless as she'd appeared. Dad had been right. I was his greatest investment, and that investment was about to pay dividends that Derek never saw coming. That evening, I sat in my car in our driveway for 20 minutes before going into the house, trying to process everything Judge Harrison had shown me. I was no longer the financially dependent woman Derek thought he was divorcing. I was a wealthy woman with substantial assets, detailed documentation of my husband's crimes, and a team of experienced lawyers ready to fight for me. But I was also terrified. For 8 years, I'd let Derek make all the major decisions in our relationship. I deferred to his judgment about money, career choices, and our future. Now I was holding a cashier's check for $50,000 and inheritance documents worth millions, and I had no idea how to handle that kind of power. Derek's BMW was already in the garage when I finally went inside. I could hear him on the phone in his home office, probably talking to Candace about their day or making plans for their future together. The sound of his voice, casual and happy, made my stomach turn. He was still playing the role of devoted husband while secretly dismantling our marriage. I went to the kitchen and started making dinner, falling back into the routine that had defined our relationship for years. But everything felt different now. As I chopped vegetables and stirred sauce, I kept thinking about the property deeds in my purse, the business partnerships that made me wealthier than Derek had ever dreamed, and the surveillance photos of him with Candace that could destroy his reputation in court. Smells great in here, Derek said, appearing in the doorway and kissing my cheek. What's for dinner? Chicken parmesan, I replied, not trusting myself to say more. Derek loosened his tie and grabbed a beer from the refrigerator. Good, I'm starving. Had to skip lunch for a client meeting. He paused, studying my face. You okay? You seem quiet tonight. Just tired, I managed. Long day. It wasn't entirely a lie. Learning that your dead father had been secretly wealthy and had documented your husband's affair was definitely exhausting. Derek settled at the kitchen counter with his beer, launching into a story about his day that I only half listened to. He was complaining about a difficult client, the same client he'd probably told Candace he was having lunch with while they planned their future business together. Actually, Derek said, I might be working late tomorrow night too. This project is really heating up. Another late night with Candace? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Derek's beer paused halfway to his lips. What? My heart pounded, but I forced myself to sound casual. Your secretary, Candace. Doesn't she usually help with the big projects? All right. Yeah, she'll probably be there too. Derek's voice was carefully neutral. Why do you ask? Just wondering. It seems like you two have been working together a lot lately. Derek studied my face for a moment, and I saw a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. But then he shrugged and took another sip of beer. She's good at her job. That's why I hired her. The conversation moved on to safer topics, but I could feel Derek watching me more carefully for the rest of the evening. I'd have to be more careful about hiding what I knew until I was ready to act on it. That night, after Derek went to sleep, I spread all of my father's documents across the dining room table and began studying them more carefully. Judge Harrison had given me copies of everything, but I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with before my next meeting with Mrs. Patterson. The scope of Dad's business empire was staggering. He'd owned pieces of nearly every major development project in the city over the past 15 years. The construction company that bore his name had built shopping centers, office complexes, and residential developments throughout the region. His property management company oversaw hundreds of rental units, generating steady monthly income that had been accumulating in investment accounts for years. But what impressed me most was how carefully Dad had documented everything. There were detailed records of every business decision, every partnership agreement, every financial transaction. He'd built his wealth methodically and legally, always ensuring that he had proper documentation for everything he did. The contrast with Derek's business practices was stark. The surveillance reports showed that Derek had been cutting corners, hiding income, and manipulating financial records to avoid taxes and minimize his reported assets. While my father had built his empire through careful planning and legal compliance, Derek had been taking shortcuts that could destroy him if they became public. I found a particularly damning report about Derek's offshore accounts. He'd been funneling money through a series of shell companies to hide assets from tax authorities and, apparently, from me. The amounts were substantial, nearly $500,000 that he'd concealed over the past 3 years. There were also detailed financial records showing how much Derek had been spending on Candace. Expensive dinners, jewelry, weekend trips, and even a luxury apartment that Derek was renting for her. He'd been funding a complete second life while telling me we needed to be careful with money. But the most revealing documents were email exchanges between Derek and Candace that Dad's investigators had obtained through legal channels. Reading them made me feel sick, but they also strengthened my resolve to make Derek pay for his betrayal. "Can't wait until this divorce is finalized," Derek had written in one email. "Amara has no idea what she's entitled to, and my lawyer says we can probably settle for less than 20% of actual assets. She'll take whatever I offer because she doesn't have the resources to fight it." Candace's response was equally callous. "Poor little Amara. Maybe this will teach her not to marry above her station. Some people are just meant to be followers, not partners." They'd been laughing about my situation, treating the destruction of my marriage like a game they were winning. Derek had systematically isolated me financially, then planned to discard me with as little compensation as possible while moving on to his new life with Candace and the wealth they'd built together. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated who my father was and what he'd left me. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, making notes and organizing documents. By the time I went to bed, I had a clear understanding of my position. I was wealthier than Derek, I had better legal documentation than he did, and I had evidence of his financial crimes that could send him to prison if I chose to press charges. More importantly, I had something Derek didn't, the moral authority that came from being the wrong party. He was the one who had cheated, lied, and tried to steal from me. I was simply claiming what was rightfully mine and ensuring that he faced consequences for his actions. The next morning, Derek left for work without the usual kiss goodbye. I could tell he was still thinking about my questions from the night before, wondering if I suspected something. Good. Let him worry. I called Mrs. Patterson as soon as Derek was gone. "Amara?" Her voice was surprised. "How are you holding up?" "I need to see you immediately," I said. "I have new information that changes everything about my case." "What kind of information?" "The kind that means Derek isn't going to get away with what he's trying to do to me." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment. "Can you be here in an hour?" "I'm already on my way." As I drove to Mrs. Patterson's office with a briefcase full of documents that would change my life forever, I thought about what Dad had written in his letter. He'd wanted me to become the person I was meant to be based on my own talents and drive, not because I knew there was money waiting for me. Well, I had become that person. I'd survived Derek's betrayal, discovered my own strength, and was ready to fight for what I deserved. The money and power were just tools that would help me win a battle I'd already decided to fight. Derek thought he was divorcing a naive woman who would accept whatever he offered. Instead, he was about to face a woman who had inherited not just wealth, but her father's business acumen and determination to never let anyone push her around. The real Amara Thompson, daughter of Robert Mitchell, was finally ready to stand up and be counted. Mrs. Patterson's reaction to my father's documents was everything I'd hoped for and more. Her eyes widened as I spread the property deeds, business partnership agreements, and asset summaries across her desk, and by the time she finished reviewing everything, she was practically glowing with anticipation. "Amara," she said, setting down the last document with a satisfied smile, "this changes absolutely everything about your divorce case. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Your husband has been operating under the assumption that you're financially dependent on him with no substantial assets of your own. These documents prove not only that you're independently wealthy, but that you have documentation of his hidden assets and financial crimes." Mrs. Patterson explained that the timing of the will revelation was legally perfect. Since the will had never been properly probated due to administrative delays, It could be presented during the divorce proceedings as newly discovered information that materially affected the division of assets. The fact that your father's will was delayed isn't suspicious, since there are records of the administrative issues at the probate court. It just happens to be incredibly fortuitous timing. What about Derek's reaction? He's going to be shocked. That's the beauty of this situation, Mrs. Patterson said with obvious satisfaction. Derek positioned himself as the wealthy spouse divorcing his financially dependent wife. When it's revealed that you're actually wealthier than he is, his entire legal strategy collapses. She showed me how the new information would affect every aspect of the divorce settlement. Instead of Derek paying me modest alimony, I could potentially argue that no spousal support was needed at all, since I had substantially more assets than he did. Instead of splitting our marital home, I could buy out his share entirely and keep the house if I wanted it. More importantly, Mrs. Patterson continued, the evidence of Derek's hidden assets and financial crimes gives us tremendous leverage. We can threaten criminal charges if he doesn't cooperate with a fair settlement. Criminal charges? Tax evasion, financial fraud, money laundering through those offshore accounts. Your father's investigators documented everything beautifully. Derek could face serious prison time if this information becomes public. The thought of Derek in prison was both satisfying and terrifying. I wanted him to face consequences for his betrayal, but I wasn't sure I was ready to be responsible for destroying his life completely. What would you recommend? I asked. We use the threat of criminal prosecution to ensure he agrees to a settlement that's actually fair, based on the real assets involved. He keeps what's legitimately his, you keep what's yours, and he pays significant damages for the emotional distress and financial manipulation he's put you through. Mrs. Patterson explained her strategy for the court hearing. We would present my father's will as newly discovered information that had to be considered in the asset division. The judge would be required to review the documents and potentially delay the divorce finalization until the inheritance could be properly evaluated. Judge Harrison will handle the will presentation personally, since he's the executor of your father's estate. Having him there will add tremendous credibility to our position. Judge Harrison mentioned that his wife is the judge overseeing our divorce case. Is that going to be a problem? Actually, it's perfect. Judge Patricia Harrison is known for being extremely fair but also very tough on people who try to manipulate the system. When she sees evidence that Derek has been hiding assets and planning to defraud you, she's going to be furious. Mrs. Patterson spent the next hour walking me through what would happen at the court hearing. Derek and his attorney would arrive expecting a routine divorce finalization. Instead, they'd be confronted with evidence that Derek had been lying about his assets while I'd been concealing wealth that made me more financially powerful than he'd ever been. The key is to let Derek reveal his hand first, she explained. Let him present his settlement offer based on his false assumptions about your financial position. Then we'll reveal the will and watch his entire strategy fall apart. What about Candace? Will she be there? Probably. But that actually works in our favor. When Derek realizes he's about to lose everything, he might try to blame his actions on her influence. That never plays well with judges. Mrs. Patterson also warned me about Derek's likely reactions to the revelation. He would probably go through several stages: shock, anger, attempts to reconcile, and finally desperate bargaining as he realized the full extent of his exposure. Whatever he says, whatever promises he makes, remember that this is the same man who spent months planning to leave you with nothing while he started a new life with another woman. Don't let temporary remorse make you forget what he really thinks of you. That afternoon, I met with Judge Harrison to finalize the presentation of my father's will. His office was buzzing with activity as his staff prepared the comprehensive documentation that would be presented to the court. Your father would be so proud of how you're handling this, Judge Harrison told me as we reviewed the documents one final time. He always said you had more strength than you knew. I'm still scared, I admitted. This is going to destroy Derek's life. Derek made his own choices, Amara. You're not responsible for the consequences of his actions. Your only responsibility is to protect yourself and ensure you get what you're legally entitled to. Judge Harrison showed me a letter my father had written specifically for this moment, to be read aloud in court if the situation ever arose where I needed his full support in a legal battle. Robert asked me to present this as part of the will reading if you ever face someone trying to take advantage of your perceived vulnerability, Judge Harrison explained. He wanted to make sure everyone in that courtroom understood exactly who you are and where you come from. The letter was vintage Dad, loving but firm, protective but empowering. He'd written it as if he'd known exactly what Derek would try to do to me, and he'd crafted his words to make it clear that I was not someone to be underestimated or mistreated. "Are we really going to be able to pull this off?" I asked. "Amara, your father spent 15 years building the legal and financial foundation that's going to protect you tomorrow. I've spent the last week preparing documentation that will make Derek's deception impossible to deny. Mrs. Patterson has built a case that's absolutely bulletproof. We're not just going to pull this off, we're going to win decisively." That evening, I went through my normal routine with Derek, making dinner and pretending everything was fine. But inside, I felt like I was vibrating with nervous energy. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, Derek would discover that the woman he'd underestimated and planned to discard was actually more powerful than he'd ever dreamed. Derek seemed distracted during dinner, checking his phone frequently and making cryptic comments about big changes coming soon. I realized he was probably texting with Candace about their plans for after the divorce was finalized. They had no idea that their celebration was about to become a disaster. "You seem nervous about something," Derek observed as we cleaned up after dinner. "Just thinking about tomorrow," I replied honestly. "The divorce finalization? Don't worry about it, babe. It's going to be quick and painless. We'll both be free to start new chapters in our lives." The casual way he said "start new chapters" made my blood boil. He was so confident that his plan had worked, that he'd successfully positioned himself to keep most of our assets while leaving me with next to nothing. He had no idea that tomorrow he would discover he'd been playing chess while I'd been playing three-dimensional chess with the help of my father's brilliant long-term strategy. That night, I lay awake listening to Derek sleep peacefully beside me, probably dreaming about his future with Candace and the wealth he thought he'd successfully hidden from me. I thought about the moment tomorrow when Judge Patricia Harrison would read my father's will aloud in that courtroom, and Derek would realize that everything he thought he knew about me had been wrong. My father had been right about me being his greatest investment. Tomorrow, that investment was going to pay dividends that would change my life forever and ensure that Derek faced real consequences for his betrayal. I couldn't wait to see the look on his face when he realized he'd underestimated Robert Mitchell's daughter. The morning of the court hearing, I woke up before my alarm, my heart racing with anticipation and nervousness. Derek was still sleeping, looking peaceful and confident, completely unaware that his world was about to crumble in a few hours. I slipped out of bed quietly and got ready in the guest bathroom, putting on the navy blue suit I'd bought specifically for this day. I wanted to look professional and strong, not like the financially dependent wife Derek expected to see. Derek was making coffee when I came downstairs, dressed in his best charcoal suit and humming cheerfully. He looked like a man about to close the biggest deal of his life. "Ready for this to be over?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee with that familiar smug smile. "More ready than you know," I replied, taking the cup but avoiding his eyes. We drove separately to the courthouse, Derek in his BMW and me in our Honda. As I parked and walked toward the building, I saw Mrs. Patterson waiting for me on the front steps, looking professional and confident. Behind her, Judge Harrison was getting out of his car with a briefcase full of documents that would change everything. "How are you feeling?" Mrs. Patterson asked as we walked inside together. "Terrified and excited," I admitted. "Is that normal?" "Completely normal. You're about to take control of your life in a way Derek never expected. That's both empowering and scary." Inside the courtroom, Derek was already seated with his attorney Preston, both of them looking relaxed and confident. Preston was shuffling through papers with the casual air of someone who expected this to be a routine proceeding. Derek kept glancing back toward the gallery, and I saw Candace slip in through the back door, wearing a red dress that was probably meant to celebrate their victory. Judge Patricia Harrison entered promptly at 9 o'clock, looking stern and professional behind the bench. She was smaller than her husband but carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Good morning," Judge Harrison said, settling into her chair and reviewing the case file. "We're here today for the finalization of divorce proceedings in the matter of Thompson versus Thompson. Mr. Preston, I believe you'd like to present your client's final settlement offer." Preston stood confidently. "Yes, Your Honor. My client has prepared a very generous settlement that we believe is fair to both parties." He began outlining Derek's proposed division of assets. I would get the house with its substantial mortgage, the older Honda, and a monthly alimony payment of $1,500. Derek would keep his business, his BMW, his boat, and his retirement accounts. According to Preston's presentation, this represented an equal division of marital assets. "Your Honor," Preston concluded, "my client has been more than fair in this settlement. Mrs. Thompson will be well provided for, while Mr. Thompson retains the business assets he built through his own hard work and expertise." Derek was nodding along, looking pleased with his attorney's presentation. In the gallery I could see Candace smiling. Judge Harrison looked at me. "Mrs. Thompson, do you accept this settlement as presented?" I stood up slowly. "No, Your Honor, I do not." Derek's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't part of his script. Mrs. Patterson stood beside me. "Your Honor, we have significant new information that materially affects the division of assets in this case." Preston jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. This is clearly a delay tactic. Mrs. Thompson has had months to present any relevant information." "Actually," Mrs. Patterson replied calmly, "this information only became available to my client yesterday, due to administrative delays in the probate of her father's estate." Judge Harrison leaned forward with interest. "What kind of information are we talking about, Mrs. Patterson?" "We have documentation showing that Mrs. Thompson has substantial inherited assets that were not previously disclosed, because the inheritance was not legally finalized until yesterday." The courtroom went completely silent. Derek's confident expression changed to confusion, then concern. "Furthermore," Mrs. Patterson continued, "we have evidence that Mr. Thompson has been concealing significant marital assets through offshore accounts and shell companies." Derek's face went white. Preston was frantically whispering in his ear, but Derek wasn't listening. He was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Judge Harrison studied the papers Mrs. Patterson handed to her. "This appears to be quite complex. I think we need to examine this new evidence carefully before proceeding." That's when Judge Harrison, the retired judge, stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, if I may approach the bench? I am the executor of Robert Mitchell's estate and can provide clarification on the inheritance documentation." Derek's head snapped around as he recognized Judge Harrison from various business events around the city. "Wait," Derek said, his voice cracking slightly. "What's going on here?" Judge Patricia Harrison looked at her husband with obvious surprise but nodded for him to approach. They had a brief, whispered conversation, then she addressed the courtroom. "It appears we have a highly unusual situation. Mr. Harrison will present information about Mrs. Thompson's inheritance, which was apparently delayed due to probate issues." Judge Harrison opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Your Honor, I have here the last will and testament of Robert Mitchell, Mrs. Thompson's father, which due to administrative delays was never properly probated following his death 5 years ago." Derek was leaning forward in his chair, straining to hear every word. His confident demeanor had completely evaporated. "Mr. Mitchell left explicit instructions about the timing of when his assets should be transferred to his daughter," Judge Harrison continued. "He specified that the inheritance should only be revealed when she faced a significant life crisis and had actively sought help by discovering his private papers." "What kind of assets are we talking about?" Judge Patricia Harrison asked. Judge Harrison smiled slightly. "Commercial real estate holdings valued at approximately $5 million, partnership interests in 6 local businesses worth approximately $2 million, and liquid assets of approximately $1 million. The number $8 million seemed to echo through the silent courtroom. Derek's mouth literally fell open. Candace gasped audibly from the back row. $8 million? Derek whispered, then louder, "That's impossible. Her father was a janitor." Judge Harrison turned to look directly at Derek. Mr. Mitchell was indeed employed as a night janitor. He was also one of the most successful commercial real estate investors in this city. "In fact, Mr. Thompson, I believe your company leases office space in a building that Mrs. Thompson now owns." Derek looked like he might faint. "Amara owns my building?" "Among others," Judge Harrison replied pleasantly. "Now, Your Honor, there's one more document that Mr. Mitchell asked me to read aloud if his daughter ever faced someone trying to take advantage of her perceived financial vulnerability." Judge Patricia Harrison nodded. "Please proceed." Judge Harrison unfolded a letter and began reading in Dad's voice that I could almost hear. "To anyone who thinks my daughter Amara can be pushed around or taken advantage of, you have made a serious error in judgment. Amara is Robert Mitchell's daughter, which means she comes from strength, intelligence, and determination that has been building for generations. She is not a woman who can be dismissed, underestimated, or mistreated without consequences. Anyone who tries to harm my daughter will discover that she has resources and support that extend far beyond what they imagine possible." By the time Judge Harrison finished reading, Derek was slumped in his chair, his face gray. Preston was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how much trouble his client was in. "Your Honor," Mrs. Patterson said into the silence, "we also have evidence that Mr. Thompson has been concealing marital assets through offshore accounts and shell companies, with the apparent intention of defrauding Mrs. Thompson in these divorce proceedings. She presented the surveillance reports documenting Derek's hidden accounts, his secret relationship with Candace, and his plans to minimize my settlement while keeping the majority of assets for himself. Judge Patricia Harrison reviewed the documents with obvious displeasure. When she looked up, her expression was stern. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "are you aware that concealing assets during divorce proceedings constitutes fraud?" Derek tried to speak but only managed a strangled sound. "Your Honor," Preston jumped up, "my client would like to request a recess to review these new developments." "I'm sure he would," Judge Harrison replied dryly. "However, given the evidence of deliberate asset concealment and the revelation of Mrs. Thompson's substantial independent wealth, I think we need to completely reconsider these proceedings." She turned to Derek, who was still staring at me in shock. "Mr. Thompson, it appears you've been operating under some serious misconceptions about your wife's financial position. It also appears that your own financial disclosures have been less than honest." Derek finally found his voice. "Amara," he said, turning to me with a desperate expression, "we need to talk. This changes everything. We can work this out." For the first time that day, I spoke directly to my husband. "You're right, Derek. This does change everything. But we're not working anything out. You made your choice when you decided to cheat on me and try to steal what was rightfully mine. But I didn't know. You didn't know I had money, so you thought it was okay to betray me? That just proves what you really thought of me all along." Judge Patricia Harrison banged her gavel. "Mr. Thompson, I suggest you consult with your attorney about the criminal implications of asset concealment before you say anything else that might incriminate you further." As the judge called for a recess to allow both sides to reassess their positions, Derek sat frozen in his chair while Candace fled from the courtroom. His entire world had just collapsed, and he was finally beginning to understand that the woman he'd tried to discard was more powerful than he'd ever imagined. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I was floating. My father's plan had worked perfectly, and Derek was about to learn what it really cost to underestimate Robert Mitchell's daughter. The recess gave Derek and Preston 30 minutes to absorb the reality of their situation, and when we reconvened, the change in their demeanor was striking. Derek looked like a man who'd aged 5 years in half an hour, and Preston had the grim expression of a lawyer who knew his client was in serious trouble. Judge Patricia Harrison resumed her seat and addressed the courtroom with barely concealed irritation. "Have both parties had sufficient time to reassess their positions in light of the new information?" Preston stood slowly. "Your Honor, my client would like to withdraw his previous settlement offer and requests time to prepare a revised proposal that reflects the new financial circumstances." "I'm sure he would," Judge Harrison replied dryly. "However, given the evidence of deliberate asset concealment and fraud, I'm not inclined to give Mr. Thompson additional time to manipulate the situation further." She turned to Mrs. Patterson. "Does your client have a counter-proposal?" Mrs. Patterson stood confidently. "Yes, Your Honor. Given that Mrs. Thompson now has substantially greater assets than Mr. Thompson, and given his attempts to defraud her during these proceedings, we propose the following. Mrs. Thompson will retain all of her inherited assets. Mr. Thompson will retain his legitimately disclosed business assets. However, any assets that Mr. Thompson concealed during these proceedings will be forfeited to Mrs. Thompson as compensation for his fraudulent behavior." Derek shot to his feet. "That's not fair. You can't take my money just because I didn't mention every account." Judge Harrison fixed him with a withering stare. "Mr. Thompson, you will address this court properly or you will be held in contempt. And not mentioning hidden offshore accounts is called fraud, not an oversight." Preston put a restraining hand on Derek's arm, but the damage was done. Derek had essentially admitted to concealing assets in front of a judge. "Furthermore," Mrs. Patterson continued, "Mrs. Thompson requests that Mr. Thompson pay her legal fees and damages for the emotional distress caused by his deception and adultery." "How much are we talking about?" Judge Harrison asked. $200,000, Your Honor." Derek made a strangled noise. Between the forfeited hidden assets and the damages, he was looking at losing nearly $750,000. "Your Honor," Preston said desperately, "that's excessive. My client made some poor personal choices, but—" "Your client committed fraud," Judge Harrison interrupted. "He deliberately concealed marital assets with the intention of depriving his wife of her legal share of those assets. In some jurisdictions, that's a criminal offense." The word criminal hung in the air like a threat. Derek was now facing not just financial consequences but the possibility of criminal charges. "However," Judge Harrison continued, If Mr. Thompson agrees to the settlement as proposed and makes full disclosure of all concealed assets, I'm inclined to treat this as a civil matter rather than referring it for criminal prosecution. It was a clear ultimatum: accept the financial penalties or face possible prison time. Derek looked frantically between his lawyer and me, finally seeming to understand that all his careful planning had backfired spectacularly. Amara, please. We were married for 8 years. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the courtroom on me. This was my moment to make clear exactly how I felt about Derek's betrayal. 8 years, I repeated. 8 years during which I supported your career, managed your home, entertained your clients, and gave up my own financial independence to help you build your business. 8 years during which you convinced me that we were partners working toward a shared future. Derek's face was pleading, but I wasn't finished. And during those 8 years, you were secretly moving money offshore, planning to divorce me, and sleeping with your secretary while mocking me to her face. You called me a situation that you needed to manage. You laughed about how easy it would be to leave me with nothing because I was too trusting to protect myself. Derek winced with each accusation, finally understanding how completely his private conversations had been documented. So no, Derek, those 8 years don't mean anything to me anymore. They were 8 years of lies, and I'm done pretending they were anything else. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. Mr. Thompson, do you accept the settlement as proposed by Mrs. Thompson? Derek looked at Preston, who whispered urgently in his ear. After a moment, Derek slumped in defeat. Yes, he said quietly. I accept. Very well. This court orders that Mr. Thompson will pay Mrs. Thompson $200,000 in damages, forfeit all concealed assets to Mrs. Thompson, and pay all legal fees associated with these proceedings. Mrs. Thompson will retain all inherited assets and waives any claim to spousal support given her independent wealth. Judge Harrison banged her gavel. This divorce is granted. Mr. Thompson, I suggest you consider yourself fortunate that Mrs. Thompson is choosing not to press criminal charges at this time. As the courtroom cleared, Derek sat motionless in his chair while Preston packed up his papers with obvious relief that the ordeal was over. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see Judge Harrison smiling at me. Your father would be so proud of how you handled yourself today, he said quietly. Thank you. For everything. As I walked out of the courthouse with Mrs. Patterson, I felt lighter than I had in months. Derek's attempt to destroy my life had not only failed, but it had revealed resources and strength I hadn't known I possessed. Over the following weeks, the full extent of Derek's downfall became clear. Word of his fraudulent divorce proceedings spread through the local business community, damaging his reputation and costing him several major clients. Candace, faced with the reality that Derek was no longer the wealthy businessman she thought she was dating, broke up with him and found a new position with one of his competitors. Derek was forced to liquidate several assets to pay the settlement and legal fees. He lost the boat, had to sell the BMW, and ended up moving into a modest apartment across town. His consulting business survived, but barely, and he spent most of his time trying to rebuild the professional relationships his actions had destroyed. Meanwhile, I used my inheritance to start a charitable foundation in my father's honor, focusing on educational opportunities for children from working-class families. I also launched my own marketing and design firm, finally pursuing the career ambitions I'd set aside to support Derek's dreams. 6 months after the divorce, Derek called me wanting to meet for coffee to explain himself and ask for my forgiveness. I declined politely but firmly. I had no interest in relitigating the past or helping Derek ease his guilt about what he'd done to our marriage. I was too busy building my new life to waste time looking backward. The woman Derek had tried to dismiss as financially dependent and lacking ambition had become one of the most successful businesswomen in the city. My marketing firm was thriving, my charitable foundation was making a real difference in the community, and I was finally living up to the potential my father had always seen in me. Derek had underestimated Robert Mitchell's daughter, and that mistake had cost him everything he thought he valued. But it had given me something far more valuable than money: the knowledge that I was stronger, smarter, and more capable than I'd ever dared to believe. My father's investment in me had paid dividends beyond anything he could have imagined. 1 year after my divorce was finalized, I stood in the conference room of my marketing firm, looking out at the city skyline and reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed. My company, Mitchell Marketing Group, had grown to 15 employees and was handling campaigns for some of the city's largest businesses. The charitable foundation I'd established in Dad's honor had awarded scholarships to over 100 students and was funding educational programs throughout the region. But the most important change was how I felt about myself. The insecure woman who had once defined herself through her husband's success was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to claim it. "Ms. Mitchell?" My assistant knocked on the conference room door. "Your 3 o'clock appointment is here." I'd kept my maiden name for business purposes, partly to honor my father's legacy and partly because I never wanted to forget the lesson I'd learned about the importance of maintaining my own identity. Derek had once convinced me that being his wife was my most important role in life. I would never make that mistake again. My afternoon appointment was with Nathan Cross, an architect who was designing a community center that my foundation was funding. We'd been working together for 3 months on the project, and I'd been impressed not just by his professional expertise but by his genuine commitment to creating spaces that would serve the families who needed them most. Nathan was everything Derek wasn't. Humble, honest, and interested in making a positive difference rather than just accumulating wealth and status. He was also incredibly attractive, with dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a smile that made me remember what it felt like to be genuinely interested in someone rather than just going through the motions of a relationship. "Amara," Nathan said as he entered the conference room with rolled blueprints under his arm, "I have some exciting updates on the community center design. Over the past few months, our professional meetings had gradually become more personal. Nathan would stay after our official business was finished to talk about books, travel, and our shared interest in supporting local communities. He'd asked me to dinner twice, and both times I'd declined, not because I wasn't interested but because I wasn't sure I was ready to trust my judgment about men again. "Let me show you the latest revisions," Nathan said, spreading the blueprints across the conference table. "I think you're going to love what we've done with the children's library space." As he walked me through the design changes, I found myself watching his hands as he pointed out different features, noting the way his face lit up when he talked about creating spaces where kids could feel safe and inspired to learn. This was a man who cared about things that mattered, not just about building an empire or impressing people with his success. "Nathan," I said as he finished his presentation, "this is beautiful. My father would have loved seeing something like this built in his memory." "Tell me about him," Nathan said, settling into a chair across from me. "I know he was successful in business, but you always talk about him like he was much more than that." So I told Nathan about the man behind the empire, the father who worked nights to provide for his daughter, who built wealth not for its own sake but to ensure his family would always be secure, who taught me that real success meant lifting up other people rather than stepping on them to get ahead. "He sounds like a remarkable person," Nathan said when I finished. "I can see where you got your values." "It took me a while to remember those values," I admitted. "I lost myself for a few years there, trying to be someone I thought I was supposed to be instead of who I really was." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "We all do that sometimes. The important thing is finding your way back to yourself." "Is that what you did?" I asked, curious about his story. Nathan told me about his own journey, a marriage that had ended when his ex-wife decided she wanted someone more ambitious, someone willing to prioritize money over meaning. He'd spent 2 years rebuilding his life and career around projects that mattered to him rather than just ones that paid the most. "I learned that the right person will appreciate who you really are," Nathan said, "and the wrong person will try to change you into someone else." The contrast with Derek was stark. Derek had spent 8 years trying to make me smaller, more dependent, less confident in my own judgment. Nathan seemed to appreciate my strength and independence, and he never made me feel like I should apologize for my success or tone down my ambitions. "Amara," Nathan said as he prepared to leave, "I know we've talked about this before and I know you've said you're not ready to date. But I was wondering if you might consider making an exception for dinner tomorrow night. Not business, just us." I looked at this kind, talented man who had spent months patiently showing me that not all relationships were about power and manipulation, that some people actually valued honesty and genuine connection. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how easily the word came. "I think I'd like that very much." Nathan's smile was radiant. "Really? Really? But I should warn you, I'm still learning how to trust people again. My divorce was complicated." "I know," Nathan said gently, "and I'm willing to go as slowly as you need to." That evening, I called Mrs. Patterson to update her on my life. She'd become not just my lawyer but a friend and mentor, someone who had helped me navigate not just my divorce but my transition into becoming a successful businesswoman. "I'm so proud of you, Amara," she said when I told her about Nathan and how happy I was becoming. "You've built something beautiful from what could have been a devastating situation." "I had a lot of help," I said. "From you, from Judge Harrison, from my father's planning." "You had support," Mrs. Patterson corrected. But you made the choice to fight for yourself. Not everyone would have had the courage to do what you did. Later that night, I walked through my new house, a beautiful craftsman-style home in a historic neighborhood that I'd bought with my inheritance. It was nothing like the McMansion Derek and I had shared, with its cold modern lines and emphasis on impressing visitors. This house was warm and welcoming, filled with books and art and comfortable furniture that reflected my actual tastes rather than some designer's idea of what successful people should want. I thought about Derek, who I'd heard was struggling to rebuild his business and his reputation. Candace had moved on to another wealthy businessman, leaving Derek to face the consequences of his choices alone. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just a quiet relief that his attempts to destroy my life had failed so completely. My phone rang and for a moment I tensed, hoping it wasn't Derek trying to contact me again. Instead it was Nathan. "I hope it's not too late to call," he said, "but I wanted to tell you how happy I am that you said yes to dinner tomorrow." "I'm happy too," I said and realized I meant it completely. "I'm looking forward to it." "Good. And Amara? Thank you for taking a chance on getting to know me. I know it's not easy to open yourself up to someone new after being hurt." After we hung up, I sat in my living room thinking about how far I'd come in just 1 year. I'd gone from being a financially dependent woman trapped in a failing marriage to being a successful entrepreneur with a thriving business and a charitable foundation that was making a real difference in people's lives. More importantly, I'd rediscovered who I was beneath all the insecurity and self-doubt that Derek had cultivated in me over 8 years. I was Robert Mitchell's daughter, and that meant something. It meant I was strong enough to fight for myself, smart enough to build something meaningful, and worthy of being loved for exactly who I was. My father's letter had been right. I was his greatest investment, not because of the money he'd left me, but because of the person he'd raised me to be. The inheritance had given me the tools to fight Derek's betrayal, but my own strength and determination had won the battle. Tomorrow night, I would have dinner with a man who appreciated my success rather than feeling threatened by it, who valued my independence rather than trying to undermine it. I would continue building my business and my foundation, creating the kind of life my father had always hoped I would have. Derek had tried to reduce me to nothing, to make me disappear into his shadow while he built his empire with another woman. Instead, his betrayal had revealed just how much power I'd always had, power that came not from money or status but from knowing my own worth and refusing to settle for less than I deserved. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed in my beautiful home that was entirely mine, I smiled thinking about what Derek would say if he could see me now. The woman he'd dismissed as lacking ambition had built a more successful and meaningful life than he'd ever managed, even with all his scheming and manipulation. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's about building something so beautiful and fulfilling that their attempts to hurt you become irrelevant. I had everything Derek had tried to take from me: financial security, professional success, and the respect of my community. But more than that, I had something he would never understand. The deep satisfaction that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anyone convince you to be less. Robert Mitchell's daughter was finally living up to her full potential, and that was worth more than any amount of money Derek could have stolen from me. My father's greatest investment had finally matured, and the dividends would last for the rest of my life.